And joining me now to discuss this is Colin Hay, who is Professor of Political Science at Sciences Po here in Paris. That's the Political Science University. So, Colin, this debate today, it's the second time the Lords has discussed a major issue which it wants amended. What's the issue today? And can you tell us about some of the other to and fro between the House of Lords and the House of Commons on this?
Yeah, well, essentially what we have is a very short piece of legislation that the British government prepared, presented to the House of Commons. It was 2 paragraphs long. It was supported by the House of Commons. The House of then gets discussed by the House of Lords. And there are two issues. There are two amendments on the table. The first, they've already voted in favour of, rejecting in some sense the Commons deal that was agreed. And this is about protecting the status of EU residents in the UK after Brexit in some sense, giving them essentially the same rights they have now and guaranteeing that in advance. The House of Lords has voted in favour of that yesterday, and that's a problem for the government because the government didn't want that deal then. And then they're going on today to discuss a further set of issues about the nature of the vote and the consultation with Parliament. Essentially, what the House of Lords will probably vote in favour of today is a proper vote in the House of Lords and the House of Parliament on the question of Brexit and the deal itself. So essentially, they could put back to the Cameron government, they say, we don't like this deal, we want you to negotiate, to renegotiate. That's not on the table at the moment, but that's what they're asking for.
So they're voting today to, in effect, have a veto on the eventual deal that Theresa May and her negotiators might agree with the other 27.
That's exactly it. Essentially, what the government wants is a situation in which the vote is only on the question of yes or no. What the House of Lords want is the option of a proper vote, which would give the option of saying it's neither yes nor no, it's renegotiate this. We don't like what you're putting to us because this is problematic or that's problematic or whatever.
Okay. Well, ultimately, of course, the House of Lords can't stop any legislation. It can only give its opinion, and then there's a back and forth between the Commons and the Lords. Yep. So the government will go ahead with what it wants. Can we talk about some of the other obstacles from the United Kingdom point of view to Brexit? Let's look at the situation in Scotland and Northern Ireland. Where are we now on Scotland? Of course, the First Minister in Scotland said if Britain votes to leave the European Union, we might have another referendum about whether Scotland should become independent. Where are we on all that?
It's complicated, and it remains complicated, and in some sense it's become even more complicated even than it was before. Essentially what Scotland wants, what the SNP wants, what the Scottish government wants is a separate deal for Scotland. Now, it became clear for a little while that actually that separate deal could be nothing other than just access to the single market for Scotland, not necessarily full EU membership, but just continued access to the single market for Scotland. The Cameron government the May administration rather has made it very clear that it can't allow a separate deal for Scotland. So essentially the Brexit deal has to apply to Scotland. And that means that if Scotland does indeed want a separate deal, then it needs to vote for independence. The problem, however, is that Nicola Sturgeon is not clear that if she were to hold a referendum...
Nicola Sturgeon, the First
Minister of Scotland and leader of the Scottish National Party, is unclear that there is a majority for independence at the moment. And she doesn't really want to call a referendum until she knows that that's clearly the case. So there's a bit of a standoff between the two. And in fact, in the last few days, Theresa May is almost taunting Nicola Sturgeon to call this independence referendum. She's saying, come on then, you say that you want a separate deal for Scotland, and you know now that in order to get a separate deal for Scotland, Scotland needs to vote for independence. So where's this second independence referendum?
And of course, that first referendum, those who wanted independence were defeated, but many of them voted to stay within the United Kingdom because they thought that way they could safeguard their position within the European Union. That's now changed. So
yes, it's an interesting kind of situation because if one looks also at the campaign for Scottish independence, it started with public opinion very, very much against Scottish independence. No one thought it would be very close. But in a way, the independence argument won the campaign and so the referendum in the end was very close. Now public opinion is much closer, though it appears at the moment in the polls to be in favour of remaining within the UK for Scotland. But if there was a similar move during the campaign, then Scotland would indeed vote for independence. So it's very much on a knife edge. It's a delicate issue for both sides.
Okay. I want to move on to talk a little more about the rest of the European Union shortly, but perhaps before we do, you could just say a word on the position of Northern Ireland. That's very complex.
It's complicated. And again, it's a question of trade-offs. In one sense, what the British government wants to avoid are two things, but it probably needs to decide between one or other of them. The first thing that it ideally wants to avoid is a situation in which it has to re-establish essentially a land border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland and police this border as a trade and customs border and all the rest of it. And it's kind of indicated it doesn't want to do that. But the problem, however, is if it doesn't do that, then it needs to create a kind of passport border between the whole of the island of Ireland and the rest of Great Britain. And that's problematic too. So it's really got to decide between these two options, and it's not clear what they'll go for.
Endlessly complex. Two of the clear priorities, it seems, of the government in the wake of Brexit are cutting immigration. They have interpreted this vote to leave the European Union as enormously a vote against immigration.
Yep.
And the second issue, which they're very clear they want to do, is to remove Britain from the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. Let's take those two. Immigration, Theresa May has also said, Britain will be a global trading nation, we're open to the whole world. Doesn't that mean that India, many other countries will say, yes, we'll trade with you, but we want visas and we want our people to live in your country? How is Britain going to deal with that?
It's deeply ironic because, in fact, what happened is as soon as the vote was for Brexit, Theresa May became clear that she really needed to start negotiations with other potential countries to show that she could sign some new trade deals. The first place she went to was India. And of course, the negotiation started. It wasn't an official negotiation, but an informal negotiation, became very clear that what the Indians wanted was visas, a greater number of visas, which is deeply embarrassing because the government's trying to restrict migration. And so just repackaging migration so you get more migration from other non-European countries is not the solution. So there is a problem for the British economy. It relies on migrant workers, and it's relied very much on highly skilled migrant workers from the EU. In some sense, British industrialists, British employers want to ensure that there are high levels of migration of high-skilled labour, and it's exactly what they're saying to the House of Lords Europe Commission all the time.
And this issue of the European Court of Justice, who would arbitrate if there's a trade dispute, if Britain is no longer under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice?
That's very difficult. I mean, in one sense, the challenge to the May administration is to answer that question. And it hasn't really even begun that process yet. Now, that depends on a number of things. But it depends above all on the terms of Britain's leaving. If Britain were to leave essentially without a trade deal, then it would be the WTO that would determine those relations. Britain would have no more access to the European market than a country like Canada, for instance. But that is seen as catastrophic economically for Britain.
We've talked a lot about this from Britain's point of view. So far, the European Union has remained oppressively united, the other 27 members. No one has spoken officially to Britain. And they're very wary of Britain trying to play one country off against the other. How's this going to pan out once Article 50 is triggered?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, in one sense, you're right to say how will it pan out once Article 50 is triggered, because in one sense we won't really know until Article 50 is triggered what kind of politics the British government will play. It's true that it doesn't appear that the British government has been kind of picking off European partners and trying to persuade them behind the scenes. We've had no evidence of that. In some respects, the EU 27, the 28 minus Britain, is united, I think, largely because actually it's been relatively easy to be united against the position of the May administration. I think they didn't expect that the May administration would say it's all about migration. Migration is the bottom line. If migration is the bottom line, then I think it's actually quite easy for the EU 27 to say, well, okay, if that's what you want, then you can't have access to our markets on the kind of privileged terms that you seek. And they will remain united on that as long as migration is the key issue.
This is enormously complex. I wonder if you've just got time for a very quick word. How do you think all this Brexit debate is affecting Marine Le Pen's position here in France. She has advocated a referendum on France leaving the European Union.
She has indeed. I think Brexit plays very heavily in her mind. I think what's in her favour, in some sense, is that the economic consequences of Brexit are as yet unclear. So it appears that Britain hasn't massively suffered yet from Brexit, and that makes it look credible that France might not suffer similarly if it were indeed to vote for Frexit.
OK, well, this will go on and on. Thank you so much. Colin Hay, Professor of Political Science here at Sciences Po University here in Paris, and we didn't even get to talk about the money side of things, the 60 billion or not, before Britain leaves.